This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, in a significant and potentially catastrophic escalation, Israel has launched an attack into Lebanon, attacking a lot of Hezbollah fighters and bases. And Hezbollah responded with a flurry of rocket attacks back at the Israeli military, and what appears to be the potential for a serious escalation of tensions between Hezbollah and the Israeli military. People and diplomats are scrambling throughout the region to forestall this in what many see as the most significant escalation in the war right now. And despite this escalation between Israel and Hezbollah, Jamal, Palestinians in Gaza continue to be squeezed into smaller and smaller zones. 2.2 million Palestinians who arguably have no place safe to go are being given evacuation orders across the Gaza Strip. And despite being told to evacuate to, quote, safe zones, they continue to be attacked by the Israeli military and U.S.-made bombs, killing hundreds of Palestinians in this last week. There's no end to sight in the war in Gaza, Jamal. Starvation and famine continue. And despite that, the DNC, Jamal, the Democratic National Committee, in this last week had what I called a Festival of Denial, celebrating, partying, and celebrating what they seemingly believe will be a victory in November for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Despite that, behind the scenes, there were active debates, active dissension, all covered up by the mainstream media, having to do with the denial of allowing Palestinian uncommitted voters the opportunity to speak. You know, Jamal, rather ironically, they allowed Israeli citizens to speak at the DNC, but they refused to allow any Palestinian voices or any of the uncommitted to speak about the horrors of the genocide. We'll be commenting on that today. But before we get to that, Jamal, there's been a very historic and important development in the BDS movement. In a historic move for pro-Palestinian advocates, the Canadian Revenue Agency issued two significant proposals to revoke the charitable status of two important organizations, the Jewish National Fund of Canada, as well as the Nieman Foundation of Canada, which raises money in Canada tax-free to send to Israeli settlers, as well as other Israeli organizations. The Canadian author and activist EES Angler is going to discuss the evidence, as well as the events that led to this significant BDS victory. It's a really great interview, Jamal.
That's right, Jess. And even I talk about the implications of this because now in the UK, they're using Canada's model to go after these so-called charitable organizations. And guess who is the biggest donor? You don't have to guess, but it's the United States, and we share a border with Canada. So if the IRS or the Justice Department wants to get its cue, all that they have to do is just contact the Canadian authorities. And I'm sure millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars are illegally transferred to Israeli illegal settlements from right here in the United States. So let's watch EES Angler. In an historic move for pro-Palestinian advocates, the Canadian Revenue Agency recently issued two significant proposals to revoke the charitable status of both the Jewish National Fund of Canada as well as the Nieman Foundation Canada. Both have funneled tens of millions of Canadian dollars in tax-deductible donations to fund illegal settlements in Israel, as well as Israel military infrastructure, in direct contravention of Canada's policy and tax rules. The Jewish National Fund of Canada is one of Canada's long-established charities, and although the Canadian Revenue Agency launched an audit after a formal complaint was filed in 2017 that it was funding illegal settlements as well as Israel's military, it was not until August of 2024 that the agency moved to revoke its tax-exempt status. Joining us on Arab Talk, EES Angler, in his recent article, End of JNF Charitable Status, a Big Win, Little Thanks to Left, he explains the significance of this event and the catalyst behind it. Yves is a Montreal-based activist and author who has published numerous books, including his latest, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. Welcome back to Arab Talk, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
Start by explaining what the Jewish National Fund is, its history, and why the revocation of its charitable status is particularly important.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Jewish National Fund is the linchpin of the Zionist colonization process. It was set up in 1901. The Canadian branch was set up in 1910. And basically what it did pre-state was it acquired land for exclusive Jewish use as part of, alongside the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, as the central institutions to basically colonize Palestine for a European settler movement. So it's a very important institution. It got about 3 or 4% of historic Palestine before Israel was created. And then after 700,000 plus Palestinians were driven from their homes, it was given another couple million dunams in land, and now it controls about 13% of historic Palestine, and it also has influence over much of the rest of the land. And it's openly racist. Like, it doesn't hide the fact that its purpose, its raison d'être, is to have control the land for world Jewry, is how they frame it. So, people who grew up in Vancouver are they're holding it in trust for them, but not for people who are Palestinian. So it's this old institution. Now, JNF Canada, more specifically, it has been a charity since 1967. So since Canada brought in charity rules, and what the charity rules mean, of course, is that people who donate to the organization can get a tax deduction. So essentially, the government is subsidizing their donation to the organization, and it's been contested in Canada going back at least since 1978, and that's when a Palestinian, Ismail Jaid, who was him and his family were driven from one of the villages that was taken over, that was conquered by Israel in 1967. And they built Canada Park. So JNF Canada in mid-70s, early 70s began. It was launched in 75. The Canada Park, which was on the remnants of 3 villages that were stolen in 67. And so he began campaigning, began denouncing the fact that the Canadian government was subsidizing it. And the Canadian Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Diefenbaker, has bisects the park, and there was a big event for him when it was launched and stuff like that. So this is a really egregious example of what JNF has done, and it's JNF Canada that built this Canada Park. And so there's been campaigning since then. Now, in fact, what you stated at the start doesn't seem to be correct. We don't know this. We're only getting what we're hearing from the JNF Canada inside. And so, in fact, there was in 2017, there was a formal complaint, probably the most elaborate formal complaint submitted by a number of individuals with the support of independent Jewish voices and Ismail Jaid and different individuals. But what it seems to have happened is actually there was already an audit of JNF that dates back, I believe, to 2013. And so this formal complaint just added weight. But basically, we know that there's been campaigning on the JNF. There's been rallies at JNF galas. They have the annual Negev fundraisers across the country. I've been to many of them over the past 15, 20 years. So they've been taking place across the country. So we know that the Canada Revenue Agency has been aware. We have internal government documents going back 15 years. They've been aware that it's an explicitly racist organization, but also that it's violating international law and supporting illegal colonies in the West Bank. as well as the fact that we've shown how they've been funding projects that assist the Israeli military. All of that, according to current Canada Revenue Agency rules, all of that violates the rules. And on top of that, they have very bad financial practices. They're listed a 1 out of 5 by the main charity observing group. So basically what it seems to have, we don't have the internal government documents yet because they aren't allowed to release them until the final legal battle is ended. And JNF is refusing to release the documents. So they're obviously very incriminating of the JNF Canada. But it basically seems that the mix of their explicit racism, their support for the Israeli military, their support for West Bank colonies, as well as bad financial practices, all that together, and literally decades of campaign, or 4 decades of campaign in the case of Ismail Zaid, who actually is still alive in Halifax. He's a retired professor. All that together, finally, the CRA moved. And I would venture to guess, we don't know this as well, but the climate of the last 10 months, the popular uprising against Canada's complicity with the Holocaust in Gaza, I think that may also have sort of further contributed to them to finally acting on something they should have acted on decades ago.
So the Canadian Revenue Agency states plainly in its guide for Canadian registered charities carrying out activities outside Canada, and I'm paraphrasing here, that increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of Canada's armed forces is charitable, but supporting the armed forces of another country is not. Describe some of the projects the Jewish National Fund earmarks its donations for that violate this.
Yeah, the JNF, now they have publicly said that since the CRA brought this to them in 2016, that they have stopped funding projects supporting the Israeli military. But yeah, they funded roads that are basically used by the IOF, the Israeli military. They funded recreation centers on military bases. So they say they claim this is just, we're just, I don't know, supporting the troops is kind of how they frame it. They depoliticize it, but as you know, it's absolutely explicit, right? The rules of the CRA are explicit, and the important point here, I think, beyond the JNF, I think that the JNF's role in supporting the Israeli military, this goes back, I mean, since 67, just after 67, there's examples of JNF Canada building these roads that were basically for the Israeli military. I mean, they were roads, but they were ways to keep an eye on Gaza. They were ways to keep an eye on communities in the West Bank. But the JNF, those rules are really explicit. But the JNF is actually less than a number of other groups. There's groups like the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association that was listed on the IDF's website as one of the 6 organizations internationally where people who want to support the IDF should give money to, right? And the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association has its charitable status still. There's the Hessig Foundation, which was set up by these billionaire power couple, Hessig Foundation for Lone Soldiers, this one of the wealthiest Canadian families, the Jerry Schwartz and Heather Reisman, and they have raised $200 million since it was set up in mid-2000s for mostly, not entirely, mostly for bursaries for non-Israelis who join the Israeli military. They've also actually provided money directly to the Israeli military and projects that are, even more direct. But the main thing they do, and they advertise it as that, is basically we try to provide all kinds of financial support to non-Israelis, New Yorkers, Montrealers, people from Vancouver who join the Israeli military. So there's all these organizations in Canada that are supporting the Israeli military, and yet, as you read out, the rules of charity guidelines are absolutely crystal clear. There's no ambiguity there. It is not a charitable practice to support not just Israel's military. This is not about Israel being this brutal colonial force. This is just about Canadian nationalism. The Canadian nationalism says, well, we will subsidize people funding our military, but we're not going to subsidize the Bolivian military. We're not going to subsidize the Mexican military. We're not going to subsidize. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the fact that the Israeli military is this, brutal force that's been slaughtering Palestinians for, 75 plus years. So for us, for those groups like Just Peace Advocates, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, EES Canada, PAJU, who've been working on this charity question, the revocation of the JNF charitable status and the revocation of the Neiman Foundation. Again, the Neiman Foundation is one where we, back in early 2003, we put in a formal complaint. There hasn't been much campaigning on the Neiman Foundation, but about 2 years ago, we put in a formal complaint. The fact that the Canada Revenue Agency has finally acted, this is a real big boost. This is, because in my opinion, this is Canada's biggest contribution to Palestinian dispossession. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars every year going to different projects in Israel, and a lot of them, and we've submitted a dozen formal complaints of different charities for violating CRA rules, and we know there's dozens more. They're sending 100 million plus a year to projects, these different charities that we've submitted complaints on that violate, again, West Bank colonies, contrary to CRA rules, racist organizations that the CRA says it upholds racism. So if you're supposed to be anti-racist, in fact, so if you're supporting explicit racist organizations in Israel, you shouldn't be having charitable status. So this is a really big boost. The revocation of JNF is a really big boost and NEMA is a really big boost for the movement here. But I should also say it's a big boost internationally. We just saw yesterday, or actually on Thursday, the International Center for Palestinian Rights in the UK, they sent a legal letter to the Attorney General in the UK, calling for them to move against the charitable status of the JNF, and they cite the win that was had here in Canada, and we will, again, when we get the full explanation for why they were revoked. I think if it's centered on JNF racism, and that's explicit, right? The UN has said that, this U.S. State Department, Israeli Supreme Court, many different groups have pointed out JNF racism. If it states explicitly that they were revoked because of the racism of the JNF, that is the raison d'etre of the JNF. And there's no way that JNF US, JNF UK, JNF Australia, and the 50 other JNFs around the world, there's no way that they can step away from racism, because the whole point of the organization is to hold land for just only for Jews. This development at the Canada Revenue Agency will definitely have significant ramifications here in Canada, but it also could really boost the global Stop the JNF campaign.
Yeah, I want to talk about that later on, but I want to also cite like few things that in your article, for example, the JNFFC likes to present itself as a greening project in Israel, planting trees, founding sanctuaries. Explain why these projects are so insidious and have nothing to do with greening the land and everything to do with ethnically cleansing Palestinians.
Yeah, well, the former Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who was a really staunch Zionist, back in 2013, they had a big celebration with him. I think they raised $5.5 million with one event in Toronto, at JNF event, and then they went and built a Stephen Harper bird sanctuary. And in fact, it appears it collapsed. It's not. They didn't actually kind of follow through with it. But basically, yeah, they plant trees that are not indigenous to the land on as a way to disappear Palestinian history. And the clearest example of this is the Canada Park, which I mentioned. They literally, on the remnants of 3 Palestinian villages, more than 5,000 Palestinians were driven from their home. They built this huge park, and in today's money, it's about $120 million was spent on this Canada Park, and it was explicitly about disappearing Palestinian history, and now they frame it as it's this park that any Israeli can come and travel to and spend some time in and they frame it kind of like, wow, who could be against parks? And that's whenever we protest the JNF events, they would always frame it in that sense. But it is explicitly about Judaizing the land. It is about disappearing, Palestinian villages and Palestinian history. There's also a ideological component of this. It's about tying Canadian Jews or U.S. Jews into the colonization project, and they have these blue boxes. This has been going on for more than a century, where young kids, put a little bit of money in these boxes, and oftentimes they're as part of a celebration, a birthday or something like that. The family member will plant a tree or a couple trees in historic Palestine for that purpose, for that person, should I say? And so there's this ideological component of kind of driving Canadian Jews into viewing themselves as part of the colonial process in Palestine. They claim to be this environmental charity. That's how they do these things for these kids here in Montreal. They call them treeathons, and there'll be like 12-year-olds that are trying to raise money for these treeathons. But I should also state, it's an interesting kind of dynamic, because a lot of the rhetoric would be this very liberalish, environmental kind of rhetoric. But then at the same time, the JNF is not like it's a very aggressively Zionist organization, right? It doesn't hide that. Like, they'll, here in Montreal a couple of years ago, they have this JNF Day where all these kids, a couple hundred kids, mostly from Jewish schools in Montreal, will come, and they'll do, promote the JNF and have fun JNF stuff. But they show maps of what they consider Israel in these JNF days, and that of course includes all of the West Bank, right? So they wipe out even against the, again, Canadian government claims that they believe that the West Bank is supposed to be Palestine, and here you have JNF Canada, who is taking this fairly maximalist Zionist outlook on what is Israel. So they promote this. They frame their activities as green, as this sort of liberal green. Who could be against this? But then simultaneously, they're pretty open about the fact that they're quite aggressive Zionist, both in terms of land theft and in terms of being pro war.
I should mention, then, when you're talking about these trees that they've been planting, which are not indigenous to the region, has contributed to the recent fires that Israel gets every summer. And I've been through these parks. We're talking about alpine trees that don't belong basically in a hot climate, and they are intended to cover. When you walk through these forests, you come across these little remnants of the Palestinian villages. I mean, and people go there for picnics and walkabouts, and they don't realize they're really like picnicking over the remnants of Palestinian villages, that families used to live there, where they're sitting. You talked about. Now let's talk about the complicity of the Canadian government in all of this. In your example, you give many examples of how Canadian government officials were complicit in the Jewish National Fund Canada's projects that furthered the ethnic cleansing and occupation of Palestinians in Israel. Can you give some examples?
Well, 3 or 4 days before the revocation was announced, Stephen Harper had 2 fundraisers. He's now our former prime minister. He's not the sitting prime minister, but for JNF Windsor, Ontario, and JNF London, Ontario, he was the speaker at that event. Pretty much every Canadian prime minister has participated in a JNF gala. The current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, going back to Diefenbaker, Lester Pearson, Brian Mulroney, all these different ministers. When a couple of years ago, we had a picket at the one here in downtown Montreal, Irwin Cotler came. He's a very prominent, he was former minister. The mayor of Montreal was supposed to be there. I don't know if he ended up showing up. Then the former mayor, Denis Coderre. This is the second most powerful, in my estimation, this is the second most powerful Zionist charity. The Jewish federations are the most powerful charities in the Zionist charities in the country. But after that, the JNF is I think the second most powerful. So it goes all the way up in terms of the complicity, and I think that the I'm not sure if this is part of where you were going with the question, but the Canada's long support for the JNF, the fact it's been here since 1910s, the fact that all these different top politicians that have participated in their events and helped fundraise for them. This is part of Canada has been this very sympathetic terrain for Zionism, and we've lots of fundraising for the colonization process before 1948. Canadians who fought to conquer Palestine as part of the British Empire in 1917. Canadians then who were participated in the ethnic cleansing in 47, 48. Former World War II Canadian veterans, many who went. They led the nascent Israeli Air Force Canadian. All the way up until today, where you have the Justin Trudeau government, which has very much enabled the horrors in Gaza. The minister making multiple what she called solidarity, foreign minister solidarity missions to Israel, Canadian weapons sales. You have this Canada-Israel free trade agreement that accepts products from the occupied West Bank. You have ties between the Canadian military and the Israeli military. So Canada is, after the U.S. and obviously historically the U.K., I'd say Canada has really been the sort of third major enabler of Palestinian dispossession over the past 120, 150 years even. So there's a really long history of Canadian support for Israel. But we also have, here in Montreal, we've had at least 120 demonstrations over the past 300 or so days against what's going on. You have I would say, really a popular uprising, the biggest popular uprising on international affairs I've ever seen against Canada's complicity in the genocide in Gaza.
So although the JNFC was acting in contravention of Canada's policy and tax laws, it appears that the government was not willing to revoke the charitable status of organizations illegally funding Israel without substantial pressure. And you talked about that, and you talked about the current atmosphere of what's going on with the genocide, the ongoing genocide in Gaza. But do you think also the advisory opinion issued this July by the International Court of Justice, finding that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory patently illegal with clear legal consequences for member states at the United Nations, played a role?
I think it contributed around the edges, but the reality is that the Canadian government has shown that it's willing to violate international agreements, its own laws when it comes to Israel, right? By Canadian law, we should not be selling any weapons to Israel. It's very clear. As Canada is also a signatory to the International Arms Trade Treaty, which says if there's a plausible, if it may be used in human rights violations, you can't sell. How could anyone look at what's happening in Gaza and not say, well, they're likely to be used in to violate human rights? So that's the same thing we found. We've been doing, going back to 2020, we did this whole push on the Foreign Enlistment Act. So by the Foreign Enlistment Act, it's illegal to induce Canadians to join another country's military. Not just about Israel, any military. This goes back to the 1930s. And the government and the RCMP refused to take our very formal complaints. So you had a lawyer, very elaborate. We had a whole big public thing with Roger Waters and Noam Chomsky signed. It even got on the front page of the front French paper here in Montreal. But they just refused to look at it. There's also a War Crimes Act, Crimes Against Humanity Act, and there's all these Canadians who are fighting right now. Some of them who boasted, not necessarily about what their recent killings, but in previous their occupation of West Bank. So they are completely willing to violate Canadian laws when it comes to supporting Israel, to not uphold Canadian laws. I think that the ICJ, what's going on here is the CRA, the Revenue Agency, is a more independent institution than Global Affairs Canada, or even for that matter, than the RCMP, the police. And so within that, it's so clear that JNF has so clearly, and a whole bunch of other charities have violated their rules. Did everything they could to not revoke the charitable status of the JNF specifically. The Neiman's a bit different case, because the JNF is a very, very powerful institution, unlike the Neiman Foundation. And the JNF just, it was just so clearly violating the rules. And then you combine that with the fact that you have the ruling, the ICJ ruling, the fact that there's this popular uprising. The fact that I also think that, if you look at who makes up the revenue agency staff, well, most of them in Ottawa, the younger staff who probably began this whole process, they've been through University of Ottawa, the Carleton University. Over the past 2 decades, both of those universities have had substantive Palestine solidarity movements. So almost certainly these government bureaucrats, they've sort of been exposed to that sort of, those arguments and those things. And so that, I think that's what's happened here, is you have a sort of a culmination of processes going on over decades internally within the CRA. You have a certain degree of independence within the revenue agency. Then you have these just horrors that Israel's committing. And then you have the fact that there's, popular uprising. And you have staff members within the agency basically willing to say, okay, it's clear they're violating rules. I'm willing to put a bit of my personal stake behind that because, I know something about this issue because I'm seeing popular uprising, and they acted. And so I think it does have, beyond the specifics, which are important, and cutting off that funding is very important. I think it is a bit of a harbinger of the fact that there is a change of attitude, within the government and bureaucracy. And this is not, let me make this absolutely clear, this is not Justin Trudeau doing this. That's how the hardline Zionists are trying to frame it. This is absolutely not at a political level. This is happening at an internal level. I would be astounded to find out that this is a political decision. It's an internal decision that has much more about the broader shift within the culture at the bureaucracy level.
It's worth mentioning that the JNFC is now making a lot of noise about appealing its case and of being treated unfairly. That's what they're saying. But from my readings, it seems that the evidence is very clear. There were years of painstaking investigative work, tracking funds, Israel, and identifying their end goal. I mean, they're tracking it, and so I don't know about the appeal process. Once these charitable status revocations are finalized, do you foresee a further reckoning with other Canadian charities illicitly funding Israel?
Yeah, and so we should state they are revoked in practice as of today, or as of August 10th. So they can no longer do the most important thing, which was providing the tax credits. And the JNF now, if you go on the website, they state that we can no longer give donors a tax receipt. So that's effectively, they still have quite a bit of money in the bank. I think they had about $30 million, the JNF Canada. And we should state how much, JNF in single years was raising like $30 million. There's somewhere between $10 and $30 million a year over the past decade. So they've raised probably about $200 million over the past decade, and probably at least half of that would be subsidized by the taxpayer. I think there's basically no chance that there's not more of these charities that are going to be revoked. We've put in like Misrachi Canada. That I think that's likely going to be revoked. There's same thing, the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association. There's another one, Canadian Jewish Foundation, getting the full name. Another one that will likely get revoked. There's been a lot of work done on this. And even before, so about a year and a half ago now, we were already seeing changes in how the different Israel-focused charities were reporting their donations to Israel. And that's, I think, in large part because the CRA, the revenue agency, began asking more questions because of the work. And I should say principally here, Karen Rodman at Just Peace Advocates. There's a bunch of other people who've been part of it. Khalid Moulmar, Rabbi David Miviser, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute has been part of it. But there's been a lot, I should say Miles Howe also. There's been a whole lot of these complaints submitted. We've done all these, each time we submit a complaint, that it's, very formal document, we do these action alerts where we get thousands of people to call on the CRA to investigate that charity. And so going back a year plus, we already saw that this was starting to have some impact. There was clearly some discussions going on in the background. The CRA is putting a bit more pressure on some of these groups, and they were starting to change some of their kind of reporting, their very dubious reporting habits. So we expect that there will be more that will be revoked. We don't know which ones, and we don't know how long. It's a very slow, bureaucratic kind of process, especially if there's political power. In the case of a couple of the charities that we have submitted on, they are the United Israel Appeal. That's the Israel arm of the Jewish federations. That they've raised $1.5 billion since the early 90s for projects in Israel. So we would. I don't expect, if they were to revoke that will take years and years. I don't necessarily expect that in the short term, but Misrachi Canada is one of them. Regavin was being funded by them. These are, aggressive settler organizations. And I should also state, we've had the JNF campaign, like in that article I wrote, I talk about all the NDP, which is the third opposition Social Democratic Party, and all their officials who had gone to JNF events over last decades. It's only in the past few years where the NDP began starting to join this grassroots campaign against the JNF, and sort of very haltingly. But what we've had happen in the past few months is the fact that the NDP revenue critic, Nikki Ashton, has begun to sort of raise this issue. And she's begun saying there shouldn't be what's the quote, not a cent of Canadian subsidy for genocide. Well, I don't know if she means it in the broad implications, but that would be saying that all of these charities, and there's hundreds of these charities raising minimum of $250 million, it's probably more towards $500 million, maybe even more. There's some evidence, maybe even be more than that, for projects in Israel. That all these groups should be audited, investigated. Now, there are probably 30 at least organizations that are violating the rules right now, but I think the rules should be changed. There's no reason why Canadian taxpayers should be subsidizing all these, the symphonies, hospitals, all these projects in Israel, when Israel's this wealthy country. It's got a GDP per capita equal to Canada's. Canadian taxpayers are not doing that with France. We're not doing that with Sweden. There are these hundreds of charities raising funds for all these different projects in those countries. So the whole sector should be challenged. Now, it's going to be difficult legislatively to come up with, obviously get the political power to do that. And then how do you exactly word the legislation? That's a complicated thing. But in the here and now, there are, again, dozens of organizations that should have their charitable status revoked right away, and could have their charitable status revoked right away. And then, more medium, longer term, we should bring in legislation that targets the whole sector of subsidizing this apartheid state that's committing, really a Holocaust.
You mentioned earlier that there is a grassroots movement now, on the anti-genocide movement ongoing in Canada, that you've never seen something like this before. Is the average Canadian aware of this story, of what's going on with these subsidies and, the charitable contribution? And in fact, like when Canada allows this tax deductions, the government is losing money, basically, and that affects the average taxpayer. Are they complaining about this, or it's just like an inside story?
Yeah, it's mostly an inside story, and it's actually, there's a couple things remarkable in that. One is that the big media have just totally ignored this. There's a little bit of the very far right wing media tries to frame their way they responded to this is by going and saying that there's these Palestinian charities that are funding these like improper projects, and they come up with these examples probably fed to them by NGO Monitor or something like that. But mostly it's just silence. The dominant media has just been have been silent on this issue. So most people don't know. And now what's very interesting about that is that the B'nai B'rith, the Center for Israel Jewish Affairs, Francis Simon Weisel Center, they have been all silent in response. They yell and scream about every different issue, right? They have like huge, big campaigns about every different issue, right? But on the charity question, they have taken this very muted response. The CIJA, the main lobby, Israel lobby group, has responded to a couple interview requests. But I haven't looked at their Twitter the past few days, but for the first 3 weeks after this news broke, and it broke in two different phases, they hadn't said a thing on their Twitter. They didn't not even put one tweet on it. Same thing with Francis Simon Weisel. Same thing with B'nai B'rith. And I think that that's because they understand that this issue is complicated for them, because there are very good fiscal conservative reasons to be uncomfortable with this. There are very good just Canadian nationalist reasons, the whole logic of why are you funding a foreign military. And they don't want to open up the discussion. They also understand how big this is, right? Like how many of these charities are raising projects. I should say not just projects, funding money to Israel, but it's also about the Zionist educational process, right? There's all these charities. We put in a formal request around two of these schools. Okay, so there's a school in we just did this one most recently, B'nai Avika school in Toronto. A quarter of the graduates are joining the IDF. A quarter of the Toronto schools graduates are ending up in the Israeli military. And basically this school is subsidized, getting tons of public money, direct grants and charitable status, huge amount of money. And they are basically they're violating the law beyond violating CRA rules around charities. They're violating the Foreign Enlistment Act by basically having a pipeline of funneling kids to join the Israeli military. So same thing with the Tenenbaum Chat, the biggest private school in the country. They have these IDF days. They organized in March. They organized a barbecue. They sent a bunch of students, I think it was like 30 students, to Israel, where they had a barbecue session for Israeli soldiers on an Israeli military base. This is a Toronto school, registered charity, and so this, I think, is scandalous, right? People, if they learn this stuff, they're scandalized by it. But at the big picture level, you're of course correct in that there is very little knowledge about this. We've been chipping away. We have been able to start getting it further and further. We're getting, like I said, the NDP started bringing it up, and it started to percolate all across the Palestine solidarity world. But the vast majority of Canadians have no idea, of course. And yeah.
Well, I can see the silence why the B'nai B'rith and others are keeping low-key about it, because this is the tip of the iceberg. You've mentioned, you started talking about what's going on in the UK branch of the Israeli Jewish National Fund, and now they're citing what happened in Canada. But I can't help not think about the closest ally to Canada and the one we share a border with the United States. If this is going to spill over here, if the news of what happened in Canada, because as you are aware of, probably most of the money, comes as far to Israel from the United States and maybe the UK and Canada.
Oh, for sure. I mean, JNF. I looked at quickly at JNF US. They're raising more than $100 million a year, right? There is a campaign in the States, the Defund Racism campaign, that's been targeting some of these charities. They got AOC to go to a press conference 2 or 3 months ago. The New York Times had a story about that on some of these really egregious U.S. charities. And so, no, the one of the big charity expert people, he did a Canadian Jewish News interview where his big concern was that the auditors at the revenue agencies in the UK, in the US, in Australia, they're going to follow what happens with JNF Canada. So they, besides this sort of activist Palestine kind of issue, then just even at the level of these people within the different revenue agencies, they talk, they share information. So if the Canada Revenue Agency final documents about the explanation for why they got rid of the JNF's charitable status, if they're really solid, which we assume they will be, because they wouldn't have acted without that, then that will be, that very likely could appear on the desk of, I would assume the JNF US will be slower. The US is going to be the last of all this. I don't know enough about how the IRS works with the this kind of stuff, the tax stuff, but I would assume that certainly the UK, Australia, New Zealand, or wherever, that there's very likely that this leads to action there. And hopefully, hope here, of course, with the JNF specifically, is it spirals. When we're talking about 50 different countries that apparently provide charitable status, if a few of those start, falling, that will have a consequence in its fundraising. But it also, I think, could spill over into having sort of rattle the JNF KKL, the Israeli parent organization. Hopefully, hopefully it could be the JNF was central to the building the Zionist movement. Let's hope it's central to the demise of the Zionist movement.
To read Yves Engler's updates and access his impressive resources, visit yvesangler.com. You can order his books there as well. His latest is Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. Yves, I want to thank you again for coming on Arab Talk.
Thanks a lot for having me.
That's the voice and the face of Yves Angler, a Canadian author and activist discussing the recent really dramatic developments in Canada, where two proposals are put forth to shut down two Jewish and Israeli supportive not charitable organizations that have been funding basically these right-wing extremist colonial settlements and settlers in Israel, Jamal. This is, I have to say, one of the most dramatic developments in the BDS movement. As you said, the UK is taking this as a model for how to engage with the same groups in the UK. So my question for you, after speaking with Yves, is what's holding up the United States from following the lead?
I don't know, but I think people have raised these issues, and I should have mentioned also, it's not just like colonial settlements, but they also directly fund the Israeli military. And in the Canadian, so we have to kind of check the U.S. laws versus Canadian laws, but specifically in the Canadian law, it prohibits donating to any military in the world, not Israel, not the UK, Australia, wherever. You can only donate to your own military. In other words, you can support Canadian troops, but you cannot support Israeli troops or British troops or French troops for that matter. And so that's the major kind of part of the violation itself. And at the same time, writing off millions and millions of tax deductions, which is basically robbing the Canadian government from receiving taxes, giving people in Canada a way to shelter their taxes and send the money to illegal Israeli settlements to support a foreign military. And that's why now they've revoked their status, their tax status. So now the question again is like, what are the violations? You know, I mean, I'm sure if there's an investigation and they have files and files in Canada and the United States share intelligence information, these groups are all connected, you know, certainly, or cooperate or collaborate to support the same, you know, settlements and
Jamal,
support the Israeli military.
But one of the largest groups that does fundraising in the United States every single week, it's called Friends of the IDF, Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces, routinely, if not regularly, have fundraisers throughout the United States where stars, Hollywood stars, and billionaires come out to celebrate the Israeli, you know, military. It's outrageous. They raise millions and millions of dollars in the United States tax-free. So I want to say, and I agree with you, the IRS and the State Department, hey, if you're listening, Canada has taken a big step. Let's see if people's eyes will be opened here in the States.
That's right. So moving on to the big story of the week, Jess, the Democratic National Convention,
oh boy,
according to media, was on track to closing out with little or no controversy until basically its last day, when it decided to reject pro-Palestinian delegates' efforts to get a Palestinian American speaker, actually a Palestinian American lawmaker, I should say, to go on the main stage. And this is, of course, as a result, of course, of this, the uncommitted delegates, they demonstrated, they had a sit-down outside the convention. And as you've mentioned in your intro, an Israeli-American family was given center stage, but not a Palestinian American, who later on, and I should say that person is Roa Roman, and she is a Palestinian American and a Democratic member of the Georgia House of Representatives, went outside and read her statement. And she was about to endorse Kamala Harris and basically just talk about the suffering of the people in Gaza, especially the children, and calling for the ceasefire and, you know, nothing, I would say, inflammatory or anything like this. And they even offered the DNC to edit her speech. Wow. And they just strung them along for 3 days. And on the last day, they said no. So what's going to happen, Jess?
Well, Jamal, you and I both, but I have been very vocal about this, has been very clear about saying that the DNC has been in complete denial about the reality of what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine. They have disrespected the uncommitted voters, of which there are a lot. It's a large bloc within the Democratic Party. They've disrespected the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian delegates within the DNC, which is a very large number. And I think you use the word strung along, but I think it's actually more insidious and more damaging than that, because everybody that I checked in with really believed that this was a bait and switch. They gave the uncommitted group and some of the pro-Palestine solidarity activists, who are delegates, Jamal, who are delegates to the DNC, the delusional hope that just maybe at the last minute that they would be allowed to speak. But let me ask you, Jamal, do you or I really believe that the Democratic Party or Kamala Harris really, really cares about these pro-Palestine solidarity activists, or about Palestinian American views, or about the war and genocide? We've been saying for months and months and months, Kamala Harris and the DNC support genocide. Kamala Harris and the DNC, their policy on Palestine and what's happening in Gaza is no different than the Bidens. And the Biden-Harris perspective is very clear. We're going to send weapons and bombs to Israel. We're going to tolerate killing civilians with U.S.-made weapons and funding, and we don't care what happens. We're going to have a festival of love at the DNC, this open tent that they described, Jamal, except for Palestine. It was deeply insulting. Deeply insulting.
Considering that they welcomed Republicans on stage. They welcomed Republicans to speak on
Representative yes, gave a speech.
They welcomed Republicans on stage, and they speak about a large tent that, of course,
open tent, Jamal.
Open tent, but excludes Palestinians. I saw Senator Schumer said, this is the most diverse convention ever. Really, this is what he was saying. Well, we're going to talk about the repercussions. We don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I think that by doing this, they shot themselves in the foot. The race is going to be super, super tight. And these delegates, most of these delegates, you know what? A lot of them are local. Chicago also houses a high number of Arab Americans in Chicago. You know, you're very familiar with that. Yeah, Michigan, especially Dearborn, also has a large number of voters. And you're talking about places like Waynes County in Michigan. The votes are going to be down to a handful, maybe in the hundreds.
That's right.
And with doing this, the thing is about it also it couldn't have happened in a worse time. I think they say 50 million people watch the convention. I mean, those are the figures. Like 50 million people were tuned. And then immediately after that, the delegates, at least two of them, the leader and the representative, were on CNN. They were on MSNBC. They were on other networks. Basically, everybody, even the reporters were saying, why did this happen? And they brought also a spokesperson for the convention. And he's like making excuses. Yeah, we allow them a panel. What? A non-televised panel. We allowed them a panel. There were discussions. They've had a meeting.
It's BS.
And you couldn't give them 2 lousy minutes. They couldn't give them 2 lousy minutes. They had with all the music, with all the festivities, with all, who's who going on stage and everyone else. They couldn't allow them 2 lousy minutes. And the thing is, they thought they're going to do that. That's why I use the words, they strung them along, because they thought no one's going to hear about that. But now everybody knows about, every single Arab American knows about that, and their supporters.
No, Jamal, it's a big story. Despite this festival of love, which I call a festival of denial for the DNC, the biggest story at the DNC, really, if you look at it, and it was covered every day, maybe not well by the mainstream media, was covered every day. They interviewed uncommitted voters. They interviewed pro-Palestine activists and solidarity members of the Palestine Antigenocide Movement. They were given a platform. There were protests every single day. There was another group, by the way, Jamal, Muslim Women for Kamala, that decided to withdraw their support for Kamala Harris. So I can't agree with you more. I think they did shoot themselves in the foot. They feel they did their calculation. They felt like it was better for them to bring an Israeli-American family and give them, center stage, and completely ignore large segments of the DNC, of the Democratic Party, those under 35 who are anti-war, who are anti-genocide, who want a ceasefire, who don't want to send weapons to Israel to kill civilians. That community has been basically disparaged and disrespected. And as I have said for a number of months now, they're doing this at their peril. They will pay a price. It's so much closer than the Democrats believe. They're in a sugar high, right? We said that last week. The Democrats are on this sugar high. They're so excited. Everybody is excited about what's happening. I think it's a classic kind of delusion, just like 2016, Jamal. This was the same feeling that they had about Hillary Clinton. They said about Hillary Clinton, Jamal, there's no way she's going to lose to Donald Trump, right? And the polls were much more divergent. They were showing Hillary leading everywhere. Now the polls are showing it's much closer, and the Democrats are acting self-destructively yet again. To their peril, Jamal.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.